Hey and welcome back to episode 4 of the 1823 podcast mini-series, The Mental Edge, Performance Psychology at the Euros. I'm Dr. Francesca Champ.
And I'm Dr. Gillian Cook. We're both sport and performance psychologists at Liverpool John Moores University. And in the 4th episode of the 1823 podcast, the mini-series, The Mental Edge, we're going to be reflecting on some of the knockout games so far. And I think you can agree there's been some exciting points. And also previewing the England-Germany match.
Okay, so I think I've only just about recovered from the last couple of days of, I think, really exciting, surprising, thrilling football. And you probably stand with me, and so does everybody listening to this, when we say the games so far are exactly why we love this game and exactly why we probably call it the most beautiful game and the most beautiful sport. So what we've seen has been quite different, really, to in the group stages. In the group stages, a number of the games were won by the favourites, and that resulted in a number of the favourites finishing top of the group. So, for example, Italy and France. However, when it's come to the knockout stages, things have shifted quite significantly. And what we've seen is that those teams who were the favourite have actually gone out unexpectedly in the first round. So, for example, we had Croatia, who were the World Cup finalists, beat Spain 5-3 in extra time yesterday afternoon. That was then followed by France going out to Switzerland after a 3-3 draw on penalties. And penalties is something that we'll certainly refer back to and delve into more as we progress through this podcast. I certainly don't think we could do any kind of preview on an England-Germany knockout game without reverting to or considering penalties. So let's delve a little bit more into our reflections on what's happened so far and perhaps some of the reasons why. And I think pundits, journalists, those within the game, irrespective of what role they occupy, they're all talking about this knockout stage, the first round of the knockout, and why the favourites are underperforming or underachieving. And Roy Keane put it really nicely last night when he said, okay, we can review the technical elements, we can review the tactical elements of the game, we might explore physiological aspects, but what I feel like we're really doing right now as a group of pundits is trying to be experts in psychology and trying to unpick the psychological impact of being in the Euros and playing the first stage of the knockout. And I guess for us sitting together, that's probably something that we want to provide a little bit more of an insight on. We try and unpick the reasons why things have unravelled in such an unexpected way. And for me, perhaps the first thing that I'd like to refer to is the level of fatigue that these players must be experiencing and the level of fatigue that these players must be under. So, for example, I think what we've seen is that Wales have travelled a substantial distance during the group stages into their first knockout game, and they faced Denmark, who are on a real emotional roller coaster after what happened with Christian Eriksen in the group stages. More specifically, Denmark won the last game of their group stages 4-0, and they happened to replicate that for the first time ever. A team has got consecutive 4-0 wins in a Euros or international tournament. After the game, Wales attributed it, so Chris Gunter, who is one of their players, in his post-match interview, he attributed it to fatigue. And when we look at fatigue, I think that's a psychological and a physiological construct. And the psychological aspect of fatigue for me is around decision-making. The fact that it might cloud our ability to focus our attentions, might make us make slower decisions. And when we do make those decisions, they might be worse or they might be less effective. And that, again, relates to the concept of the number of goals that have been conceded in the tournament so far. So I've just touched upon the Denmark game where they scored 4 goals in two consecutive games. We've got France conceded 3 last night, Spain conceded 3, Croatia conceded 5. There's so many goals being conceded, but what's really interesting is that there's been 9 own goals so far in this tournament. And that is the same as every other tournament, every other Euros tournament between 1960 and 2016 combined. So we've had 9 own goals so far in this tournament and 9 across that huge time span of every other tournament. And there has to be a reason, there has to be an explanation. And I think my explanation for that is the fatigue element. So before I hand over to Jill, there's just one more aspect of fatigue that I'd like to discuss, and that's the impact of travelling all of those miles on the ability for a team to prepare for the first knockout game. And what we saw with Wales is that they've travelled across countries, pretty much across the whole of Europe, nearly 5,000 miles. In fact, I think in excess of 5,000 miles, over 10 times more than the Danish team in preparation and in the build-up to that game. And for me, as a sport and performance psychologist, when working with athletes in a major tournament, we would be looking at an element of stability, giving them some stability in what's otherwise a really chaotic environment and what can be a very unstable and unpredictable time period. And I think then having that disruption to their preparation, having to move almost home several times in the build-up for the game, will have really impacted them psychologically, physically, and probably further contributed to that fatigue and perhaps even burnout. And when we talk about burnout, I'm talking about that extreme physical, psychological, and emotional exhaustion that players and staff may experience after being exposed to continual stress and pressure. And I think that's just one of the reasons, but there's several reasons that things haven't unravelled the way that we expected.
I think it's a really nice point that you bring up there about fatigue and the impact that can have on the psychological side of performance. In psychology, there's something that we call ego depletion. And what that is when someone is fatigued, and either physically or mentally, and it then has a quite outsized influence on decision making and on emotional control, which it's interesting in this Euros, particularly in some of the knockout stages, the amount of red cards that we have had. And when you think the match that the Netherlands were playing against the Czech Republic, I think it was within about 30 seconds, the Netherlands team were up the park. It was a one-on-one. Obviously didn't go in, and within about 30 seconds the Czech Republic went up the pitch, and then there was the handball and he was sent off, and then the Czech Republic obviously went on to win 2-0. But that decision making, you've got football is, I suppose sport in general, but football is an enormously emotional game. You can go from within a 1 minute period, you can go from frustration of, I wish we'd scored that goal. You might also have guilt. Gosh, I wish we'd scored that. To then you can have excitement if you do score. So within a 1 minute period, you can go through 3 different emotions, which is not typical of what can happen outside of sport. And certainly with emotions and all the emotions that we can have, it's really important that players are able to regulate their emotions to ensure that their emotions are not hindering performance, but helping performance. And by emotional regulation, I just mean being able to manage and maintain optimal emotional performance. So when you've got a bit of anxiety, when you've got a bit of adrenaline, you use that to help you, to spur you on. You reframe it as, this is good energy. This means that I'm ready to perform, as opposed to thinking, oh gosh, I'm nervous, things are going to go badly. And a couple of strategies that the players might be using at the tournament to help with emotion regulation is something called attentional deployment. So that's where you're ensuring that you're focusing on what matters when it matters. So you're not focusing on the crowd or any of the distractions that might be going on. You're focusing on what matters. And another one is cognitive change. So cognitive change is just when you're reframing or reappraising, or that just means rethinking about a situation. So you're sort of thinking this is a challenge, this is a great opportunity to rise to, as opposed to, gosh, this is a threat, and changing what you say to yourself and your self-talk to ensure that you're in a better state. And one of the other really big things in psychology around emotional control is mindfulness. So that's when you're noticing what's happening, when it's happening, without preference. So you're not living in the past and thinking, gosh, why did we miss that opportunity? You're not thinking in the future, what happens if we go out? Or equally, what happens if we go through and then win the fight, win the Euros? Your complete focus and attention is in the moment, in the present, and that's when we can get these really great performances coming through. And talking about being in the present, that I think brings us quite nicely to chatting about the England-Germany game, which is coming up later on this afternoon.
And I think that's something that we're all super excited for, not long to go until kick-off now. And the England-Germany game is momentous, really, for England players, for the England staff and for the England fans, and no more than Gareth Southgate himself. So a little bit of historical context. Gareth Southgate played at Wembley in the Euros in 1996 against Germany in the semi-finals, and unfortunately it was him who missed the penalty, which meant that England weren't successful in progressing through to the final. And it was the 1996 Euros that England won their first and only ever knockout game in a European tournament, which means that England are entering this game really with a huge amount of pressure placed upon them to say, this is your history, this is your legacy, and how do we look, what impact has Gareth Southgate had? How has he shifted the character, the qualities of the squad, and how has he prepared them almost for a rematch of what happened 25 years ago? And it's quite astounding really that it's at the same stadium, Gareth Southgate's in charge, and it is against the Germans. And another interesting angle really for me would be how the Germans are approaching this tournament, in that this is Joachim Löw's final tournament in charge of Germany. He's been in charge for a number of years now with a number of successes, and they're almost undergoing a period of growth, undergoing a period of rebuild, and are entering it based on probably inconsistent performances prior to the tournament. But in typical German fashion, they entered the tournament, had a really difficult group stage, but they were successful in progressing through. I think there's a number of different factors that we need to consider when looking ahead to the game. Probably the most important of that for all of us, and the thing that you'll be most interested in, is penalties.
I think it's difficult to talk about an England-Germany game without mentioning penalties. So as you say, it's interesting to touch upon Gareth Southgate, because in an interview yesterday, he said that, yes, there are stereotypes of England and how they tend to perform in penalty shootouts. However, you mentioned the penalty that he missed at Wembley in '96. As he was saying, most of the team weren't even born when that happened. So we shouldn't allow these stereotypes to carry on. So just mentioning stereotypes there, that for me is one of the biggest elements or biggest factors that really influence England and teams playing England in penalty shootouts. So you've got something that's called stereotype threat. So that is when you are in a group that has a negative perception or negative stereotype about it. And if you're an individual within that group, you then get anxious about potentially confirming that negative belief about that group. So if you look at England, they have only won 2 out of 8 penalty shootouts in both World Cup and Euros competitions. And there you continuously hear fans groaning about penalty shootouts, continual questions from the media to the players about penalty shootout. So that stereotype threat is very much there. And the reason that stereotype threat has an influence on performance is because some research that I've been involved in, just to give an example of how stereotype threat works, is there's a stereotype that women are better than men at multitasking, and there's a stereotype that men are better than women at maths. So in the experiment, I sat 3 different groups down at different points, and it was the exact same maths test that I gave to every group, every individual that sat down. In one condition, you say to both men and women that this test has shown differences in math skills. Women tend to perform worse in that, men perform better. Whereas in the exact same test, if you say to, all you're doing is changing the instruction at the start and saying that this test has shown gender differences, this is a test of multitasking, men perform worse on that. They said the exact same test that they performed better at when they thought it was a math test, and women perform better. And the reason for that is it's about the brain's bandwidth. So your working memory capacity, when you're really worried and anxious about potentially confirming this negative stereotype, you don't have enough bandwidth to make decisions and problem solve. So that's in a more sort of academic setting, whereas in a football and a sports setting where a lot of work on stereotype threat has been done, we have found the exact same effect. And there's been a paper that has just been published looking at penalty taking with some international footballers and the idea of stereotype threat. And what they were suggesting is the reason that stereotype threat makes a difference in penalty taking is that in football or in any sport, these skills are utterly automatic. And when you start to think and start to engage the brain, you're starting to put a conscious control on something that you should just be doing automatically. So it's a little bit different to the other example. And so by then thinking about what you need to do, you then, something that you should be doing automatically doesn't quite work out. And there's a number of different strategies that England might use to overcome this stereotype threat and this performance decrement that they might get because of this perception around them. So one of them being, and it's come across in the research quite a lot, is to refute that stereotype. Think about, so for the players, that Harry Kane always knocks in penalties for Tottenham, as an example, and when they play for their clubs, they are very, very good players and usually very, very good at taking penalty kicks. So one thing that Gareth Southgate might be doing with the team around penalties is really refuting that and really enhancing the players' self-belief and seeing it as a challenge. Think how great, what national heroes we will be if we beat the Germans on penalties. But obviously I've spoken about the players there. There's also the goalkeeping angle, which you might want to talk about.
Yeah, so I think we could spend hours and hours discussing the element of penalties. And what I find really fascinating is when we get to the penalty angle, psychologists, pundits, journalists, we all delve into the players. So it was, why has Mbappe missed the penalty, as opposed to actually, why has the Swiss goalkeeper saved the penalty? What contributed to that narrative? What contributed to him making the save? And there's been quite a lot of research really around goalkeepers and how they behave in the moments prior to a penalty being taken, when the penalty is taken, and after a penalty being taken. Some of it's really surprising, but some of it is what we would expect. And so, for example, one of the most surprising things is actually a goalkeeper is much more likely to save a penalty if they remain still on the spot, on their line, whilst waiting for the opposition player to take the penalty. And the reason for that is because it allows them to focus on the ball and it takes away any distraction. But actually for goalkeepers, why they engage in that behaviour is something called action bias. So they're engaging in the behaviour of moving up and down the line or moving up and down with the aim of distracting the opposition, with the aim of intimidating the opposition. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't necessarily work. But there was also a really nice piece done on Peter Schmeichel. So he spoke a little bit about a penalty take, and he said, what happens when there's a penalty, particularly in a penalty shootout, is that the player decides everything. So the striker will decide where they place the ball. They decide the length of the run-up. They decide when to take the penalty. They decide how hard to hit the ball. And they decide where to hit the ball. So for a goalkeeper, there's very little control. Actually, the person taking the penalty is in control of most things. So he said, as a goalkeeper, what I then choose to do is I will maintain or regain some element of control by deciding exactly where I'm going to dive and when I'm going to dive before the player even steps up. So I've done my research, I've watched all the video clips, I know where this player normally puts the ball, and if they change their mind, I won't be successful. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick to my guns, because he then said a really nice quote that a lack of control or no control results in chaos. Chaos and uncertainty result in making poor decisions. They result in being less effective. So for him, that's his way of saying, I'm here, I'm present, and I'm going to do my bit, or I'm in control of a certain element of this. And I think there's lots of research that's been done around penalties with regards to how players behave and how goalkeepers behave in the moments before a penalty. So, for example, there was a really nice piece of research that was done that looked at, before a penalty, when we place the ball down on the spot, the time that's taken between the ball being placed on the spot and actually the penalty taker kicking the ball. And research shows that England are the fastest team to put the ball down on the spot and then subsequently take the penalty. So the time taken between putting the ball on the spot and kicking the penalty is the smallest for England, whereas research shows actually that we're much more effective if there's a couple of seconds between placing the ball on the spot, composing yourself, and then taking the penalty. And that was evidenced by a quote from Steven Gerrard, who said when he puts the ball down on the spot, the thing that he finds really, really difficult is waiting for the referee to blow the whistle. And he mentioned putting the ball down on the spot, you're in the right frame of mind, you're ready to go. In those just second or two when you wait for the referee to blow the whistle, actually he's now doubting himself. He's questioning where he's going to place the ball, and he's questioning his potential effectiveness. And he mentioned that it would often throw him off track, and throw him off track and he would perform less effectively. And I guess similarly with just one more point would be that when players place the ball down on the spot, research has shown that those players who turn the back to the goalkeeper are actually portraying anxiety to the goalkeeper. So they're giving the goalkeeper a subtle sign that they actually feel a little bit cautious. They feel a little bit threatened. So when you talk about challenge and threat, they have a little bit of a threat mentality about the penalty. And the final one is that the gaze. So research has shown that when a player fixates on the goalkeeper, that again is associated with increased anxiety and an increased likelihood of missing the penalty. So as sports psychologists or as practitioners that would work with penalty takers, I think there's a number of things that we can be doing. And perhaps what we see in a range of other sports is when athletes and performers engage in something called visualization. Visualization, put really simply, is something that every single one of us do on a daily basis, and that's just imagining things. So it's a visual representation of something that we might want to happen. For example, for a penalty taker, what they may do in their head is rehearse visually where they're going to put the penalty, or they may revert back to a past successful experience. So they might visualize successfully taking a penalty at club level, or for the England players, maybe even in the World Cup in the last tournament when they had a successful penalty shootout, you revert back to that, you take yourself back, you try and create as clear and as coherent representation as you possibly can of scoring that penalty, with the aim of reducing your nerves and increasing your confidence. But there's so many techniques that we could use. And Jill, I'm sure you employ this as well when working with athletes and performers.
So typically when I'll be working with footballers and we'll be working on penalties, again, people used to think about penalties as it's luck. You either win it or you use it, it's completely luck. But that is, as you were saying there, that's not true. These are very rehearsed, very planned activities. Alan Shearer very famously used to, after every training session, would be taking a penalty, and I think he used to say to the goalkeeper, I'm going to hit it into the bottom left, and every time he would just hit to the bottom left, hit to the bottom left, and so he was rehearsing that, so which then the more you're rehearsing that, the higher your confidence. But typically a strategy that I'll employ when I'm working with people around penalties is really taking a mindful approach, because it's natural when it's you against someone else. You've got lots of fans booing, you know that, or maybe cheering, that you can feel the nervous tension. You also know that you've got TV cameras on you. In the case of England and Germany, you know that the nation is watching and the nation cares about what's going on. It's very easy to get caught up in all these different thoughts. As I said earlier on, mindfulness is having your focus and attention on the present. And it's accepting that, yes, I am having a thought coming in about what happens if I miss. But instead of, trying to change it and wrestle with it and trying to push it away, usually the more we try to push thoughts away, the more they keep coming in. So instead you would just think, well, that's an interesting thought that I'm having. That's interesting. And then refocus, recenter on yourself, again, to try and get into the zone, because that's really what mindfulness is. It's about helping players get into the zone quicker and more effectively. And so it's for them to be really, as you say, you're not pushing out distractions, you're accepting that different thoughts come in, refocus on centering on yourself in the present moment, and then do what you do after most training sessions. It's an automatic thing for these players. But if it does go to a penalty shootout, it'll be really interesting as psychologists to be watching it. But I think that's not the only element that really is coming in at the minute with the build-up to the England-Germany game. It's the Ben Chilwell and Mason Mount have both had to isolate because Billy Gilmour tested positive for COVID. They both hugged him after the match, and so they were told that they had to isolate. And I think that will have quite an influence, and certainly Gareth Southgate has spoken about the influence that may have had on those players.
Yeah, and I think when we look at things in sport in terms or from a psychological perspective, we talk about these events and we frame them as something called a critical moment. And a critical moment is something that's unexpected. It's involuntary. It's not anticipated. We can't prepare for it, but it has a huge impact on us, on our sense of self and on our anxiety. And I think when we're talking about and when we're referring to anxiety, we don't mean cognitive or behavioural descriptions of anxiety. This is existential anxiety. And existential anxiety is actually related to broader questions around purpose and around meaning. And I think what will have been at the forefront of Ben Chilwell and Mason Mount's mind over the last week or so is, what does this mean for me? Where does this leave me for the remainder of the tournament? And actually, what next? And they're probably questions that none of us have known the answers to, because it's an event that none of us have had to deal with before. But that certainly will have shaped and had an impact on social interactions, on the identity of the team, on the group dynamics, on how Gareth Southgate will have had to lead the group, but also lead those two individuals as separate. And the psychological well-being and, I guess, performance readiness of Ben Chilwell and Mason Mount themselves.
It's certainly a lot of different factors will be playing into that. There may be a huge sense of frustration because of a perceived sense of unfairness. They both had to isolate, but I believe no one from the Scotland team had to isolate. So there might be a lot of frustration there. Loneliness can also really come in, and you touched upon the sense of well-being. So as a sports psychologist, you can spend quite a lot of time working with injured players because they're out of a group, so out of training and away from what they usually do. We're footballers, we've got an identity about playing football. We love playing football, love going to training. Suddenly they're not able to do that. So it's almost a little bit like that, in that you're out of a group, you're frustrated, you're not able to do what you usually want to do. But it's also different because they are able to train with each other, but just with each other. So suddenly they're out of this group that they probably really enjoy being in. They'll have a role within that group. So one of them might be the joker within the group, and suddenly they're out of that. They've lost their role. And you mentioned about a sense of purpose. So for those two players, it will have been a lot of reframing, I think, really thinking about, okay, so we cannot train with the team at the minute, so things aren't, you accept that's what's happening, but what can I control moving forward? So I think what those two players will really have focused on is around that, okay, so we're not doing exactly what we want to do, but how can we channel our energies and make a positive or the best out of this that we can? So maybe working on some other elements of their performance, the psychological side, the technical side, to ensure that they're able to play at their best when they come back.
Absolutely. And I think what we've drawn upon in all of the podcasts so far is meaning. We talk about that sense of purpose. We talk about making meaning from experiences. And I think that's probably what Ben Chilwell and Mason Mount have spent time reflecting on and trying to make sense of their experiences. So I think we've provided you with a ton of information around a range of different topics. For both of us, I think we know that tonight is too close to call. Neither of us want to call it either way, but we hope that it's a fascinating encounter, which, if going by the past games, I'm sure that it will be. We hope that you really enjoy the game, and we hope that you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.